The first time anybody offered Silas Warren $280,000 for land, he wrote the check without blinking. Cash. No loan. No financing. Just a single piece of paper with numbers written in his careful, slanted handwriting, the same handwriting his father had used and his grandfather before him. The woman behind the settlement table at the Warren County Fairgrounds stared at that check like it might disappear if she looked away. Her name was Patricia, and she'd been handling farm foreclosure paperwork for 3 years by that point, ever since the crisis really took hold. She'd processed dozens of these sales, maybe hundreds. Farmers losing everything, banks repossessing land that had been in families for generations. But she'd never seen anyone write a check for the full amount. Not once. "Mr. Warren," she said, her voice uncertain, "this is for the entire purchase price." "Yes, ma'am." "You're not financing any of it?" "No, ma'am." She looked at him, then really looked at him. Silas Warren was 50 years old that March morning in 1986, though you might have guessed older. The Illinois sun and wind had carved lines into his face that made him look 60. He wore overalls that had been patched at the knees, a jacket that had belonged to his father, and boots he'd resoled himself using a kit he'd ordered from a catalog. He didn't look like someone who had $280,000. Standing at the back of the metal building near the entrance was Victor Brennan, 49 years old, 6'2", used to weigh 250, but he'd lost maybe 30 pounds in the last year. His face had that hollow look people get when they stop sleeping, right? The land Silas had just bought used to be his. Victor watched as Silas signed his name, collected the deed, and turned to leave. Their eyes met across that crowded room. Silas didn't smile, didn't gloat, just gave a small nod. The kind of nod you give at a funeral. Victor's wife, Claudette, touched his arm gently. "We should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They left before the auction ended. Walked out into the cold March air, into a world that no longer had room for them. But the story didn't start there. It started 9 years earlier. September 1907. The morning was one of those early fall mornings where you could feel winter coming. Temperature in the low 50s. Sky gray and threatening rain. Silas Warren pulled his 1968 Ford F-100 pickup into the parking lot of the Farmers State Bank in Monmouth, Illinois at 9:15. The truck was faded blue with rust showing through on the fenders. 140,000 miles on it. He'd bought it used in 1972 for $800. The radio didn't work, but the engine ran smooth. He was there to pay his annual property tax bill. $3,475 based on an assessed value of about $800 an acre for his 480 acres. The land had belonged to his grandfather Elias, who'd homesteaded it in 1889. Then to his father, Theodore, who died in 1968. Now it was Silas's. All of it, and there wasn't a penny of debt on any of it. Silas walked into the bank carrying an envelope with his check already written out. The teller who processed his payment was a young woman named Susan Henderson, maybe 22. She smiled at him and had no idea who he was. But standing in line behind Silas was Victor Brennan, and Victor knew exactly who he was. Victor had started with 400 acres inherited from his father in 1972. 5 years later, he was farming 1,800 acres. He'd bought 3 neighboring farms all on credit. Brand new equipment, all financed. 2 John Deere 4630 tractors at $35,000 each. A 7700 combine for $48,000. His total debt load was somewhere north of $800,000. He was 43 years old and he looked like success. New Carhartt overalls, John Deere cap fresh from the package, Red Wing boots expensive, barely scuffed. The kind of man who made sure everyone knew he was there. Silas, by contrast, was 5'9", maybe 160 pounds. Overalls patched twice. Jacket that had belonged to his father. Boots he'd resold himself. His newest tractor was a 1973 International 1066 bought used for $8,500. His oldest was a 1954 Farmall Super M that had belonged to his father. 23 years old in 1907, but Silas used it regularly for cultivating and light field work. That Super M had cost $2,400 new in 1954. His father had paid cash for it, counting out $2,400 bills on the dealer's desk. The salesman had been so surprised he'd called the owner out to witness it. Now, 23 years later, that Super M was still working. 14,000 hours. Engine rebuilt once in 1968. Clutch replaced twice. Faded paint, surface rust. Seat patched with duct tape. But it started every morning and had never left him stranded. As Silas turned from the teller window, tucking his receipt into his jacket pocket, Victor spoke up loud enough for half the bank to hear. Silas, when are you going to get rid of that old junk and buy some real equipment? The bank went quiet. Maybe a dozen people there. 3 farmers in line. Elderly women at the other window. Tom Schneider, the bank manager, visible through his office window. All of them stopped and looked. Victor was grinning, but there was an edge to it. Something mean underneath. This wasn't friendly ribbing. This was Victor establishing a pecking order. My equipment works fine, Silas said quietly. His voice was level calm, but his face had gone red. That Super M is older than my kids, Victor said, stepping forward. Hell, it's older than my marriage. It's embarrassing, Silas. You're out there cultivating corn with a tractor from the Eisenhower administration while the rest of us are trying to bring farming into the modern era. Makes all of us look bad. Makes the whole county look bad. One of the other farmers in line, Bob Henderson, chuckled. He'd been making jokes about Silas's equipment for years. Silas kept his voice level. His father had taught him never to lose his temper in public. It's paid for, he said, looking Victor in the eye. Every piece of equipment I own is paid for. No loans, no notes. I sleep pretty good at night. Victor laughed, a sharp bark that echoed off the marble walls. You sleep good because you're not ambitious. You're not trying to build anything. You could be farming twice as much ground if you'd leverage what you have, but you're too scared. You're farming like it's still 1950. He looked around at the other people, making sure they were listening. My dad used to say your dad was the same way, Victor continued, his voice getting louder. Afraid of his own shadow, wouldn't take a risk if his life depended on it. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? That crossed a line. Silas's father, Theodore, had died in 1968, 9 years ago. Heart attack in the field on a hot July afternoon. Silas had found him slumped over the steering wheel of that same Super M, the tractor still running, the cultivator still in the ground. Theodore Warren had been a careful farmer, a saver, a man who believed debt was something you avoided unless you had no choice. He'd survived the Depression by being cautious. He'd watched other farmers lose everything in the 1930s because they'd borrowed too much. And he'd taught Silas the same lessons. Never borrow more than you can pay back in 1 year. Never put the land itself at risk. Live below your means and save the difference. Silas looked Victor in the eye. The bank was completely quiet now. Your dad lost his farm in 1953. Silas said, his voice still quiet but with steel in it now. Borrowed too much to expand. Couldn't pay it back when grain prices fell after the Korean War ended. I remember him selling everything at auction that summer. Every piece of equipment, every head of livestock, every stick of furniture. He paused. I was 17 years old and I went to that auction with my dad. Watched your family lose everything because your dad thought he could outsmart the market. Maybe you don't remember because you were too young. You would have been, 9 years old. But I remember. I remember your mother crying at the funeral. I remember your dad looking like someone had gut-shot him. Victor's face went from smirking to bright red. His jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists. That was different, Victor said, voice tight with anger. That was bad luck, bad timing. Maybe, Silas said. Or maybe it was bad judgment. Maybe it was thinking the good times would last forever. Maybe it was believing the banker when he said you couldn't lose. He looked at the other farmers. Markets always turn. Prices always go down eventually. The only question is whether you can survive when they do. My dad survived. Your dad didn't. That's not luck. That's preparation. Victor took a step towards Silas, and for a moment it looked like he might throw a punch. But Tom Schneider came out of his office moving quickly. Gentlemen, Tom said, putting himself between them, this is a bank, not a barn. If you want to have this discussion, take it outside. Victor glared at Silas, then turned and walked out without conducting whatever business he'd come for. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Silas nodded to the teller, nodded to Tom, and walked out himself. Outside, the morning had gotten colder. Gray clouds lower now, wind picking up. Silas climbed into his F-100 and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, taking deep breaths. He wasn't proud of what he'd said. Bringing up Victor's father's foreclosure was cruel even if it was true. But Victor had pushed him, had insulted his father's memory. He started the truck and drove home. That evening, Silas sat at the kitchen table with his wife Margaret, who everyone called Maggie. They were eating dinner. Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, the same meal Maggie had been making once a week for the 17 years they'd been married. Their son Malcolm, 4 years old, was already asleep upstairs. The kitchen table was the same table where Silas's grandfather had eaten, where his father had eaten. where Silas had eaten his whole life. The farm didn't change much generation to generation. "How was your day?" Maggie asked. "Had a run-in with Victor Brennan at the bank," Silas said. Maggie looked up. She was 38 years old, practical with brown hair going gray at the temples and hands that were never quite clean from keeping the farm books and working in the garden. "What about," Silas told her, "about Victor calling his equipment junk, about the things that had been said." When he got to the part about Victor's father, Maggie set down her fork. "You brought up the Peterson foreclosure." "I did." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he's right about us being too cautious?" she asked finally. Silas looked up at her surprise. "Do you—" Maggie set down her napkin, looked at her husband, and decided it was time. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. Silas waited. "I have a savings account, a separate one. You don't know about it." The silence stretched between them. "How much?" Silas asked, his voice careful. $8,000. Maybe a little more now." 8,000. "Yes." "How long?" 3 years, since 1974. I've been putting away 100, sometimes 200 a month when I could." Silas sat back in his chair. His face showed hurt, but also something else. Confusion. "Why?" Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was scared," she said. "Scared you might be wrong. Scared we'd end up like your grandfather during the Depression, except we'd have nothing saved because we never took any chances. Scared that one day I'd wake up and realize we'd wasted our lives being too careful." She wiped her eyes. "Everyone else is expanding, buying new equipment, taking vacations, and we're just staying the same. Year after year, I see Claudette Brennan at church with her new clothes and her talk about Florida trips, and I wonder if maybe Victor is right. Maybe you do have to take risks to build something." Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "I'm not angry," he said. Maggie looked up, surprised. "You hedged," Silas continued. "You made a bet that I might be wrong. That's smart. That's what scared people do. They hedge." He reached across the table and took her hand. "My dad told me something once. We were sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm come in. I was maybe 16. He said, 'Silas, the land will take care of you if you take care of it. But the minute you start working for the bank instead of yourself, you've lost something you can't get back. You might still be farming, but you're not free anymore.'" He looked at his wife. "I'd rather farm 480 acres free than 1,800 in debt. I'd rather have old equipment that's paid for than new equipment that owns me. And I'd rather have a wife who's smart enough to save money just in case her husband is wrong." Maggie's tears spilled over. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." "Don't be. Keep the account. Keep saving. If I'm wrong, you'll have something. And if I'm right," he paused. "If I'm right, we'll have even more put away when the others are losing everything." They sat there for a moment, holding hands across the table. "People are going to talk," Maggie said. "Let them talk," Silas said. "They'll still be talking when their equipment gets repossessed and ours is still sitting in the shed." That Sunday, Maggie experienced exactly what she'd been afraid of. The First Baptist Church Women's Circle met once a month in the church basement, officially a prayer group, really a quilting circle and gossip session. Maggie went because it was expected, because it was what farm wives did. By the time she arrived at 9:30, there were already a dozen women there, ranging from their 20s to their 70s. All farmers' wives except Mrs. Patterson, the pastor's wife, who came to keep things at least nominally religious. Claudette Brennan was already there. She sat at one of those tables near the center of the room, surrounded by 3 other women her age. She wore a new sweater, cream-colored, probably cashmere. Her hair was styled. Her nails were painted. She looked ready for a magazine photo shoot, not a church basement. Maggie wore a sweater she'd bought at Penny's 3 years ago. Her hair was in a simple ponytail. Her hands showed the wear of gardening and bookkeeping. She took a seat near the back, next to an older woman named Dorothea Henderson. Dorothea was 65, gray-haired, quiet. Her husband had farmed 600 acres until a stroke 2 years ago. Now they rented the ground and lived on the rent money. "Morning, Margaret," Dorothea said softly. "Morning." The meeting started with a prayer, then quilting. But underneath the quilt talk, another conversation was happening. "Did you see the new truck Victor bought?" Betty Henderson asked. "A Chevrolet K10, four-wheel drive." "I saw it," Claudette said, smiling. "He needed something bigger for the equipment trailer." "Must be nice," Betty said with genuine admiration. "We're blessed," Claudette said, making even that sound like bragging. The conversation shifted. Someone mentioned a new combine. Someone else talked about a trip to Florida. The subtext was always the same. Who was doing well? Who was expanding? Who had the newest things? Maggie said nothing, just focused on her stitching. Margaret, Claudette said, her voice carrying across the room. How are things at your place? It was a trap disguised as friendliness. Fine, Maggie said without looking up. And Silas still farming the same ground. Yes. We're up to 1,800 acres now. Claudette said loud enough for everyone to hear. Victor just bought the Fletcher place. Another 320 acres. He says if you're not growing, you're dying. The women around Claudette nodded appreciatively. That's a lot of ground, Betty said. It is. But Victor says we have to think big. Can't be afraid to leverage what we have. The bank practically begged him to take the loan. Maggie kept stitching, but inside she felt something tightening. How's Silas's equipment holding up? Claudette asked, and now there was definitely an edge. I heard there was some excitement at the bank this week. A few women's eyes lit up. News traveled fast in Warren County. Our equipment works fine, Maggie said. I'm sure it does, but that tractor he was using last week looked like it belonged in a museum. Doesn't he ever want something new? Something with a pipe and air conditioning. Victor's new 4630 has all that. He says it makes the work so much more pleasant. Maggie finally looked up. Our equipment's paid for. We don't owe anything on it. The room got quiet. Everyone suddenly very interested in their quilting. Claudette smiled, a tight, controlled smile. Of course, that's very prudent of you. The word hung in the air like an insult. Prudent, careful, scared. Linda Morrison, whose husband farmed 1,200 acres, joined in. But don't you ever want to go anywhere, do anything? My husband and I just got back from a week in Florida. It was wonderful. We're saving for Malcolm's college, Maggie said quietly. Oh, that's sweet, Claudette said. But he's only 4. You have years before you need to worry about that. You should enjoy life now. You only live once. Betty Henderson chimed in. My mother always said, you can't take it with you. But you can leave it to your children, Dorothea Henderson said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chatter. The old woman had been silent until now. You can leave them a farm with no debt, freedom instead of payments. The room went even quieter. Claudette's smile tightened further. Well, everyone has their own philosophy, she said dismissively. The meeting continued, but Maggie felt the judgment settling around her. These women looked at her and saw someone behind the times, someone whose husband wasn't ambitious, someone who would clip coupons while everyone else prospered. After the meeting, as Maggie was gathering her things, Dorothea touched her arm. Walk me to my car. Outside, the wind was cold. Dorothea moved slowly, leaning on a cane. Don't listen to Claudette, Dorothea said when they were out of earshot. I'm not, Maggie lied. Yes, you are. I can see it in your face. Dorothea stopped, turned to look at her. My husband and I survived the Depression. Do you know how? Maggie shook her head. We were scared, the whole time. Scared of debt, scared of losing the farm. The men who weren't scared, the ones who thought they were smarter than the market, they all lost everything. Every single one. She paused. The proudest ones always fall the hardest. You remember that. Maggie watched the old woman get into her car and drive away. Then she sat in her own car for a long moment before starting the engine. That secret savings account didn't seem quite so foolish anymore. Late that September evening, after Maggie had gone to bed, Silas walked out to his shop. A metal building he'd put up himself in 1970, 40 by 60 feet with concrete floors and good lighting. The Super M was parked inside right where he'd left it that afternoon. 23 years old, faded red paint, surface rust, seat patched with duct tape. But honest, real, paid for. Silas ran his hand along the fender, feeling the cool metal. He'd driven this tractor for 9 years now since his father died. Before that, he'd ridden on it as a kid sitting on his father's lap learning to steer. His father had loved this tractor, had taken care of it like it was part of the family. And now Silas did the same. He thought about what Victor had said, about being ambitious, about building something, about bringing farming into the modern era. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe Silas was too cautious, too scared. But then he thought about what he'd said to Victor, about the auction in 1953, about Victor's father losing everything. Silas had been 17 years old at that auction, had watched it with his father. What he hadn't told Victor, what he'd kept to himself, was what he'd learned later. Victor's father hadn't just lost the farm. 3 months after the foreclosure, he'd been found in his barn. The official story was heart attack, but Silas's father had told him the truth years later when Silas was old enough to understand. Victor's father had hanged himself. The debt, the failure, the humiliation had been too much. He'd left a wife and 3 kids with nothing. Victor had been 9 years old. That was what debt could do. Not just take your land, take your hope, take your will to live. Silas would rather be cautious than destroyed. He patted the Super M's fender. "You and me," he said quietly to the machine, "we're going to be just fine." Then he switched off the light and walked back to the house where Maggie was sleeping, where Malcolm was sleeping, where the farm books showed 480 acres owned free and clear, and in a bedroom drawer a secret bank book showing $8,000 saved, just in case. Behind him in the darkness, the Super M sat waiting, patient, paid for, still working after 23 years. And it would keep working, long after the new tractors were repossessed, long after the modern farmers discovered that leverage cuts both ways, long after Victor Brennan learned what his father had learned 24 years earlier, that the market doesn't care how ambitious you are. It only cares whether you can survive when it turns against you. Spring came to Warren County in 1978 with mud and wind and the smell of wet earth. Silas spent those waiting days in his shop going through every piece of equipment, changing oil, greasing fittings, making sure everything would start when the ground dried. The Super M got the same attention as everything else. New spark plugs, fresh oil, grease until the old stuff squeezed out, showing it had been done right. Maggie spent those same days keeping the books. Her secret account had grown to $8,200. She added to it every month, 100 here, 200 there skimmed from the grocery money and the household budget in ways that didn't show. Silas knew. He'd known since she'd told him. But he said nothing. Let her have her hedge, her insurance against his being wrong. On a warm April evening, Maggie brought up the Johnson farm. She and Silas were at the kitchen table going over the books like they did every month. The ledger showed they'd cleared $32,000 the previous year. After living expenses and taxes and savings, they'd put away about $8,000 in the main account, plus Maggie's $8,000 in the secret account. $16,000 total saved in 1 year. "The Johnson farm is for sale," Maggie said, not looking up from the ledger. Silas knew which farm she meant. Everyone in the county knew. Walter Johnson had died the previous fall at 81. His kids lived in Chicago, had city jobs, wanted nothing to do with farming. "I heard," Silas said. "It's 160 acres. Borders our land on the west." "I know. The price is $1,400 an acre, $224,000 total." Silas closed the ledger slowly. "We'd have to borrow all of it," he said. "We've got maybe $18,000 in savings. That wouldn't make a dent." "What would the payment be?" Maggie had already worked it out. At 9% over 20 years, about $2,000 a month, $24,000 a year. "We cleared $32,000 last year," Maggie said. "If we bought another 160 acres, we'd probably clear another $10,000 from that ground. So we'd gross $42,000 and have a payment of $24,000. That leaves $18,000 for everything else." "It's tight," Silas said, "but doable. And land values are going up. That ground might be worth $1,800 an acre in a few years." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "The minute we take a loan on land," he said slowly, "we don't own it anymore. The bank does." "But land values are going up," Maggie said. "Everyone says so. Tom Schneider says it's the best investment you can make. Everyone said stocks would keep going up in 1929 too." He leaned forward. "Think about it this way. If we take on a $2,000 a month payment and something goes wrong, crop failure, drought, prices fall, any of those things could happen. We'd miss a payment, then another. Then the bank would foreclose. We'd lose not just the 160 we bought, but probably our whole farm because we'd have to put it up as collateral." Maggie was quiet listening. "But if we don't buy," Silas continued, "we keep farming what we've got. No payment, no bank breathing down our necks. We save what we can. Maybe someday we buy land with cash." "But we could miss out," Maggie said quietly. "What if this is our only chance? Then we miss out on 160 acres. But we don't miss out on 480 acres we already own." Maggie took off her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes. "I just don't want to look back in 20 years and wish we'd taken the chance." "I'd rather look back in 20 years and still have a farm to look back from," Silas said gently. She nodded. "Okay." They put the ledger away and went to bed. The Johnson land sold 3 weeks later to Martin Peters from Galesburg for $230,000. Martin borrowed the whole amount at 8.5%. Everyone said Martin got a good deal. Land values were going up. The next Sunday at church, Maggie felt the judgment more acutely than ever. The women's circle had heard about the Johnson farm, about Martin Peters buying it, about the Warrens passing on the opportunity. I heard you had a chance to buy the Johnson place, Linda Morrison said during the quilting session. What happened? We decided not to, Maggie said simply. Oh, that's too bad, Claudette said from across the room. Victor would have jumped on that if it bordered our land. You have to take opportunities when they come. Maybe they were scared, Betty Henderson said, not unkindly, but the word stung. Or maybe they were smart, Dorothea Henderson said quietly from her corner. Smart how? Claudette asked, her voice sharp. Smart to watch everyone else grow while they stay the same. Smart to sleep at night, Dorothea said. I sleep just fine, Claudette shot back. In my new bedroom that Victor just had remodeled, on sheets from Marshall Fields in Chicago. The room went quiet. That kind of bragging wasn't done, not even here. You could imply wealth, but you didn't state it outright. Maggie felt her face burn. She kept her eyes on her stitching. Well, Mrs. Patterson said, trying to smooth things over, we all have different priorities. Some of us prioritize living, Claudette said. Others prioritize existing. The word hung there, existing. Not living, just existing. After the meeting, Maggie walked to her car with tears in her eyes. She sat behind the wheel for a full 5 minutes before she could trust herself to drive. That night, she told Silas what had happened. Claudette called us scared, she said. Said we just exist instead of live. Silas was quiet for a moment. Do you feel like you're just existing? He asked. Maggie thought about it, really thought about it. No, she said finally. I feel safe. Is that the same thing? I don't know, Silas said honestly. Maybe, or maybe safe is a kind of living that Claudette doesn't understand yet. What if she never understands? What if she's right and we're wrong? Silas took his wife's hand. Then we'll be wrong together, and we'll still have the farm. By the summer of 1979, things were getting strange. Inflation was running at 13%. Diesel that had cost 40 cents in 1975 was now 90 cents. Fertilizer had doubled. Seed corn was up 60%. The Federal Reserve was raising interest rates to fight inflation. Paul Volcker had been appointed chairman in August, and he'd made it clear he would do whatever it took even if it meant recession. Prime rate hit 15%. Farmers who'd borrowed at 8% suddenly couldn't refinance at reasonable rates. If you had a balloon payment coming due, your payment could double. But grain prices were still good. Corn hit $3 a bushel in the fall. Soybeans over $7. Money was flowing. Silas felt something was wrong. Prices too good. Land values too high. Too many farmers, too confident. It reminded him of his father's stories about the 1920s, right before everything collapsed. One Sunday in October after church, Tom Schneider pulled Silas aside. Silas, got a minute? Sure. I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity. Tom glanced around. The Anderson place, 200 acres bordering your land on the north. Going on the market next week. I wanted to give you first crack. What's the interest rate? I can get you 9.5%, fixed for 5 years. Silas did the math. 200 acres at 1,400 would be 280,000. At 9.5 over 20 years, about 2,600 a month. That's a big payment, Silas said. But think about it. Land values are going up 15% a year. By the time you make your first payment, that ground will be worth more than you paid. You're not spending money. You're investing it. Silas was quiet. Everyone's doing it, Tom continued. Victor, the Hendersons, Martin Peters. You don't want to be left behind. There it was again. Left behind. Let me think about it, Silas said. Don't think too long. I've got 3 other farmers interested. That night, Silas told Maggie about the conversation. To his surprise, she pushed for it. Maybe Tom's right, she said. Maybe we should take this chance. Maybe, Silas said, but his voice was uncertain. 2 days later, he went to the bank, sat in Tom's office, signed preliminary papers, not the final contract, just the commitment to purchase, the credit application. Tom shook his hand. Smart move, Silas. You won't regret this. That evening, Silas brought the final contract home. Thick stack of papers, full of legal language. He spread it on the kitchen table. $280,000, 9.5%, 20 years, monthly payment $2,612. Maggie looked over his shoulder. That's a lot of money, she said. It is. They ate dinner mostly in silence. Malcolm, now 4, chattered about something, but neither parent was really listening, both thinking about that stack of papers, about the signature line at the bottom, about the choice they were about to make. After Malcolm was asleep, Maggie went upstairs to clean out an old trunk in the attic. She'd been meaning to do it for months. At the bottom, underneath a quilt and a box of baby clothes, she found an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Theodore Warren, postmarked 1928. Inside was a letter from Elias Warren, Silas's grandfather. Maggie sat on the attic floor and read it by the light of a bare bulb. November 1928. My dear son Theodore, I am writing to you about a matter of great importance. You have mentioned in your last letter that you are considering borrowing money to purchase additional land. I must counsel you most strongly against this course of action. I have now lived 62 years, and I have seen much in that time. I have seen good men destroyed by debt. I have seen farms that had been in families for generations lost to the bank in a single season. I have seen children go hungry because their fathers borrowed money they could not repay. The times are good now. Prices are high. Everyone says they will stay high. But I remember other times when everyone said the same thing and they were wrong. Land is a blessing, but only if you own it free and clear. Land with debt attached is not truly yours. It belongs to the bank, and they will take it from you the moment you cannot pay. I am sending you the money you need to buy that land with cash. It is not much, but it is enough. I have saved it over many years, and I give it to you freely. But I ask only one thing in return. Promise me you will never put our family's land at risk with debt. Promise me you will teach your own son the same lesson. The land will still be there when prices fall. The question is whether we will still own it. Your loving father, Elias Warren. Maggie sat there for a long time holding the letter. Then she went downstairs. Silas was at the kitchen table reading through the loan documents. Maggie handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly. When he finished, his eyes were wet. I didn't know this existed, he said. It was in the trunk, under everything. Silas read it again. Then he looked at the loan documents spread across the table. The signature line still blank. He picked up the papers and tore them in half, then in half again. What are you doing? Maggie asked, though she knew. Following my grandfather's advice, 61 years late, but still. He gathered the torn papers and threw them in the trash. The next morning, he drove to the bank and told Tom he'd changed his mind. Tom was disappointed, maybe angry. You're making a mistake, Silas. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. Maybe, Silas said, or maybe it's a trap. I guess we'll find out. 3 weeks later, Victor bought the Anderson place, borrowed the full $280,000 at 9.5%. His total debt was now over $1 million. At the grain elevator, Victor made sure everyone knew. Just closed on the Anderson place. 2,100 acres now, biggest operation in the county. When he saw Silas unloading corn one November afternoon, he couldn't resist. Heard you almost bought the Anderson land. What happened? Bank turned you down. Changed my mind, Silas said, scared. Careful. Victor laughed. Same thing, isn't it? Silas didn't answer, just finished unloading and drove home. That evening, Maggie asked him if he regretted the decision. No, Silas said. I feel relieved. Even though Victor is farming 2,100 acres and we're still at 480? Especially because of that, Silas said. He's farming 2,100 acres he doesn't own. We're farming 480, that's ours. By December 1980, the economic news was getting worse. Paul Volcker had decided to strangle inflation with high interest rates. The prime rate had been climbing all year. 15 in January, 17 in June, 19 in September. On December 19, 1980, it hit 21.5%. Silas and Maggie were watching the evening news when the announcement came. Walter Cronkite's grave voice explaining what this meant for mortgages, car loans, business loans, and farm loans. Maggie looked at Silas. Thank God we didn't buy that land, she said. Silas nodded. He was thinking about Victor, about all the farmers who'd borrowed at 8 or 9%, about what would happen when those loans came due and they had to refinance at 21%. Nobody could survive that. The television showed Paul Volcker walking into a hearing, protesters holding signs. Silas reached over and took Maggie's hand. It's going to get bad, he said, really bad. How bad? Worse than the 50s, maybe worse than the Depression. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows. The farm sat in darkness. 480 acres that belonged entirely to Silas Warren, not to any bank, not to any creditor. Just him. The good times were over. The reckoning was coming, and Silas Warren was ready for it. But even he didn't know just how bad it would get. Didn't know that within 3 years, half the farmers in Warren County would be gone. Didn't know that Victor Brennan would lose everything. Didn't know that he'd be buying land at auction while his neighbors wept. All he knew was what his grandfather had written 52 years earlier. The land will still be there when prices fall. The question is whether we will still own it. Silas would still own it, and that would make all the difference. January 1980 brought news that changed everything. President Carter, responding to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, imposed a grain embargo. The announcement came on a Monday morning broadcast on every television station, reported in every newspaper. Overnight, the largest buyer of American grain, the Soviet Union, disappeared from the market. By Tuesday afternoon, grain prices were falling. Corn that had been $3 a bushel in December was $2.80 by the end of January. By February, $2.60. By March, $2.40. And it kept falling. Beans dropped from $7 to $6.50 to $6 to $5.50. The bottom was falling out. Victor Brennan sat at his kitchen table on a cold February morning with a calculator in front of him, a stack of bills to his right, and a ledger showing his crop yields to his left. His wife Claudette stood at the sink washing dishes, not saying anything, not making a sound. She'd learned over the past few months not to say anything when Victor had that look on his face, that hard, tense, desperate look. He was running the numbers for the third time that morning, hoping somehow they'd come out different. But math doesn't lie. Math doesn't care how hard you work or how much you need it to be different. Math is just math. At 2,100 acres with average yields at 240 corn, he'd gross maybe $400,000 for the year. Sounds like a lot until you considered his expenses. His loan payments alone were $36,000 a month, $432,000 a year. That left him negative $32,000 before he even paid for seed fertilizer, fuel equipment, maintenance, repairs, insurance, or put food on his table. He couldn't make it. Not at these prices. Not at these interest rates. The phone rang. Claudette answered it without saying anything, listened for a moment, then held it out to Victor. She didn't need to say who it was. He could see it in her face, the bank. Mr. Brennan, Tom Schneider's voice was professional but strained. Not the friendly voice he'd used when he was making the loans, the voice of a man doing an unpleasant job. We need to talk about your account. I'm working on it, Victor said, though he didn't know what that meant. How do you work on not having enough money? How do you work on grain prices being too low and payments being too high? You're 60 days past due on your equipment loan, 30 days past due on your land note. We've been patient, Victor. You're a good customer. We want to work with you, but we need to see some movement here. We need to see a plan. Grain prices will come back up, Victor said, though he didn't believe it anymore. He'd stopped believing it weeks ago. Spring planting demand will increase. The embargo can't last forever. Russia needs our grain. The embargo isn't ending anytime soon, Tom interrupted. Carter's dug in. And even if it did end tomorrow, we've got a massive surplus problem. Too much grain, not enough buyers. Prices could stay down for years. We need to talk about restructuring your debt, selling some assets, reducing your exposure. Victor felt something cold settle in his stomach, like ice water spreading through his insides. Sell what? He asked. I need my equipment to farm. I can't farm without tractors. Can't farm without a combine. We'll work with you, Tom said, but his voice had no warmth in it. No promise, just procedure. But we need you to come in this week. Let's sit down and see what we can do. The call ended. Victor sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, and Claudette stood at the sink with her hands in the soapy water, not moving, barely breathing. How bad? She asked, finally, her voice small. Bad. She turned to look at him. Claudette Brennan was 43 years old, and she'd spent the last 8 years living like royalty. New cars every 2 years. New furniture whenever she wanted. Trips to Florida in the winter. A completely remodeled kitchen. Clothes from the nice stores in Galesburg and even Chicago. She'd enjoyed every minute of it. Had made sure everyone at church knew they were doing well. Had looked down on women like Maggie Warren with their coupons and their old cars and their simple clothes. Now it was all falling apart, and she could see it in her husband's face. We'll figure it out, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. No belief, just words to fill the silence. By the summer of 1982, 3 farms in Warren County had gone under. Public auctions, everything sold, families displaced. The county courthouse had a bulletin board with foreclosure notices, and it grew longer every month. Silas went to each auction, not to bid, not to gawk, but to pay his respects, to stand witness. These were his neighbors, people he'd known his whole life, people he'd gone to school with whose parents had known his parents. And watching them lose everything felt like attending a funeral. At the Morrison auction in June, he stood in the back of the crowd while they sold off 30 years of accumulated equipment and tools and farm implements. A combine that had cost $60,000 new brought $11,000. A tractor that had been purchased for $42,000 brought $7,000. Shop tools that had been carefully collected over decades sold for pennies on the dollar. The Morrison family stood off to the side, the husband with his arms crossed and his jaw tight trying to maintain some dignity, the wife crying quietly into a handkerchief, their teenage kids looking lost and angry and ashamed, not understanding how their world had collapsed so quickly. Silas caught the husband's eye across the crowd, gave him a small nod. The man nodded back, and in that exchange was everything that didn't need to be said. "I'm sorry, this isn't fair. You did nothing wrong, you just had bad timing." But you are alone, Silas thought as he drove home afterward. When the bank forecloses, when the auctioneer's gavel falls, when strangers bid on your life's work, you're completely alone. Nobody can save you. Nobody can help. You just have to stand there and watch it all disappear. He pulled into his farmyard and sat in his truck for a moment, looking at his shop, his barn, his house. Everything paid for. Everything secure. He felt guilty for still having what others had lost. Guilty for being right when he'd wanted so badly to be wrong. Guilty for surviving when good people were drowning. Inside the house, Maggie was at the kitchen table with the ledger open. Malcolm, now 7 years old, was in the living room building something complicated with Lincoln logs. "Another auction?" Maggie asked without looking up. "Morrison's. I heard Betty Henderson was crying at church on Sunday. They were good friends." Silas washed his hands at the sink, looking out the window at his fields. The corn was knee-high, growing strong despite everything happening in the economy around it. Plants don't care about interest rates or grain embargoes. They just grow if you give them what they need. "Tom Schneider called today," Maggie said, still focused on the ledger. "Wants to know if we're interested in buying any of the foreclosed land coming up." "What did you tell him? That you'd call him back?" Silas had been thinking about this for weeks. Land was cheap now, cheaper than it had been in 20 years. Farmers were desperate to sell before the bank foreclosed. Banks were desperate to unload foreclosed properties at any price. A smart man with carry could buy ground for half what it had cost 3 years ago. But buying it felt like profiting from other people's pain, like being a vulture circling the dying. "I don't know," he said, drying his hands on a dish towel. "We have the money," Maggie said quietly. She looked up at him now. $387,000 in savings between the farm account and my account. We could buy land outright. No debt, just cash. I know we have the money. And if we don't buy it, someone else will. Someone who probably doesn't care about these people. Someone from Chicago or Des Moines who just sees it as an investment. At least we'd take care of it. We'd farm it right. We'd respect what it meant to the people who lost it." That was true. The land would sell regardless. The question was whether Silas wanted to be the one buying it, whether he could live with himself. He thought about his grandfather's letter, about his father's lessons, about the whole point of being careful of saving, of avoiding debt. It wasn't just to survive, it was to be ready when opportunity came. And opportunity had come, just not the way he'd wanted it to. October 1983, the notice appeared in the Warren County Record on a Thursday morning. Public auction of real estate. Victor Brennan debtor. 600 acres to be sold at the Warren County Fairgrounds on November 12th at 10 a.m. Terms cash or cashier's check. Possession upon closing. Silas read the notice twice, standing in his kitchen with his morning coffee growing cold in his hand. 600 acres. Not all of Victor's land, but a big piece of it. The first domino falling. The beginning of the end. The auction drew a crowd, maybe 200 people. Some were there to bid serious farmers with quantum or access to credit who saw an opportunity. Most were there to watch. To see Victor Brennan, who'd been so loud about his success, so quick to mock others for their caution, finally brought low. There was a dark satisfaction in it for some people. Schadenfreude. The pleasure taken in another's misfortune. Silas stood in the middle of the crowd. Not at the front where the serious bidders were. Not in the back where the gawkers stood. Somewhere in between, as a witness, as a neighbor, as someone who took no pleasure in what was happening but felt compelled to see it. The auctioneer was a man from Des Moines who'd been doing farm auctions for 20 years. He'd seen this show before many times. He knew how to keep things moving, keep emotions from boiling over, get the best price for the bank while maintaining some shred of dignity for the family losing everything. 600 acres, ladies and gentlemen, good Warren County ground, flat tillable, well-drained, been in the Brennan family since 1972. We'll start the bidding at $1,000 an acre. 1,000, do I hear 1,000? A few hands went up. Farmer Silas didn't know. Men from other counties, maybe even other states. The bidding climbed slowly. 1,100, 1,200, 1,300. At 1,400, several bidders dropped out. By 1,500, it was down to two men. At $1,600 an acre, one of them shook his head and sat down. Going once at $1,600 an acre. Going twice. Sold to bidder number 42 for $1,600 an acre. That's $960,000 total for 600 acres. Victor had paid $1,900 an acre for that land in 1980. 3 years ago, just 3 years. He'd borrowed the full amount, $1,140,000. Now it was selling for $1,600, which meant the bank would recover about $960,000. Victor was still on the hook for the difference. $180,000, plus 3 years of interest he couldn't pay, plus fees, plus penalties. The debt would follow him for years, maybe forever. Victor stood at the edge of the fairgrounds, building Claudette next to him, both of them looking like they'd aged 20 years in the 3 years since Silas had confronted him at the bank. Victor's face was gaunt hollow. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost 30 or 40 pounds. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd been through trauma, who'd watched his dreams die in front of him. Claudette looked worse. She'd lost the polished appearance she'd always maintained. Her hair needed cutting. Her clothes were wrinkled. Her face was pale, drawn, showing every day of stress. After the auction ended, after most of the crowd had dispersed, Silas walked over to where they stood. "Victor," he said quietly. Victor looked at him. For a moment, Silas thought he might say something angry, something bitter, might tell him to go to hell. But instead, Victor just looked tired, beyond tired, exhausted in his soul. "You were right," Victor said, his voice rough, like he'd been shouting or crying. "Back in '77 at the bank. You were right about all of it." "I wasn't right," Silas said, meaning it. "I was just scared. There's a difference." "No." Victor shook his head. "You were right. I was a fool. I thought I could outwork the market. Thought if it just got big enough, worked hard enough, was smart enough, I'd be safe. But the market doesn't care how hard you work, doesn't care how smart you are, doesn't care about any of it." He looked back at the fairgrounds building where the auction had been held. "I'm still farming 1,200 acres, he said. "For now, but I don't know for how long. Bank's already talking about the rest of it. Probably won't make it through next year." Claudette hadn't said anything, just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering, even though it wasn't that cold. The woman who'd bragged about remodeled bedrooms and expensive sheets now looked small and frightened and broken. "I'm sorry this happened," Silas said. And he meant it. He took no pleasure in this, no satisfaction. "Are you, Victor's voice had an edge to it now, a flash of the old anger. "You're probably happy. You warned me. I didn't listen. Now you get to be right, get to say I told you so." "I don't feel right," Silas said. "I feel sad. You're a good farmer, Victor, a hard worker. You just had bad timing, wrong place, wrong time." "Bad judgment," Victor corrected. "You tried to tell me. Hell, your whole farm tried to tell me just by existing. But I didn't want to listen. I wanted the new equipment and the big operation and everyone saying what a successful farmer I was. Wanted to prove I was better than my father, that I could succeed where he failed." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more defeated. "Turns out I'm just like him. Just took longer to fail." Silas didn't know what to say to that, so he extended his hand. Victor looked at it for a moment, then shook it. "Take care of yourself," Silas said. "You too." Silas walked back to his truck and drove home. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt heavy, like the weight of what was happening was settling on his shoulders. Good people losing everything, families being destroyed, communities being torn apart. All because of numbers on paper and interest rates and grain prices and banks that didn't care about anything except getting their money back. That evening, late after 9 o'clock, there was a knock on Silas's door. Unusual for that hour. People didn't visit that late in farm country. Everyone went to bed early to get up before dawn. Silas opened the door to find Tom Schneider standing there, and even in the dim porch light, Silas could see the man was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but definitely impaired. His eyes were glassy. His movements were careful, controlled, the way drunk people move when they're trying to hide how drunk they are. "Tom, can I come in? Need to talk to you." Silas hesitated, then stepped aside. Tom came into the kitchen, moving slowly, precisely. Maggie appeared in the doorway from the living room, saw who it was, and after a glance at Silas, quietly retreated upstairs. "You want coffee?" Silas asked. "No, don't want coffee. Want to tell you something." Tom sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the same table where so many important conversations had happened in this house. He put his hands flat on the surface, staring at them like they belonged to someone else. "I pushed them," Tom said without preamble. "Victor, the Morrisons, the Andersons, the Johnsons, all of them. I pushed them to borrow. Pushed them hard." "You were doing your job," Silas said carefully, sitting down across from him. "My job?" Tom laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "You know what my job was, Silas? My job was to make loans. And you know what I got for making loans? 3% commission. 3% of every dollar I lent out." He looked up, his eyes red. 3% of $800,000 is $24,000. That's how much I made off Victor Brennan. $24,000 in commission. He paused, letting that sink in. "I bought a boat with that money, a 26-foot cabin cruiser. Use it maybe 6 times a year. Bought a vacation home up in Wisconsin. Fish shack really, but it's mine. Sent my daughter to a private college in Massachusetts. $30,000 a year tuition. All on the backs of farmers who are now losing everything they ever worked for." Silas said nothing, just let Tom talk. Let him confess. "You were the only one who said no," Tom continued. "The only farmer in the whole damn county who wouldn't borrow. The Anderson place, the Johnson place, every opportunity I brought you, you said no. And you know what, I hated you for it. Hated that you made me look at what I was doing. Hated that you represented a different way. A harder way maybe, but a safer way, a way that didn't make me rich." He stood up, unsteady on his feet. "I just wanted you to know. What's happening out there?" He gestured vaguely toward the world outside. "It's not just the market, not just bad luck. It's me, I did this. I gave them the rope and they hanged themselves with it. But I'm the one who gave them the rope. I'm the one who told them it was safe. I'm the one who made money while they destroyed themselves." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the knob. "You were right, Silas, about everything. And I was wrong, and I have to live with that." Then he left, climbing into his Cadillac and driving away slowly into the night. Silas stood in the doorway watching the taillights disappear down the county road, then closed the door and locked it. Maggie came back downstairs. "What was that about confession?" Silas said. "I think he needed to confess to someone." "What did he confess?" "That he knew what he was doing, that he made money off loans while people lost everything, that he hates himself for it." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Do you forgive him?" "I don't know," Silas said honestly. "I don't know if it's my place to forgive him. He didn't do anything to me. He needs forgiveness from the people he hurt, from Victor and the Morrisons and all the rest." "Will they forgive him?" "I don't know that either." The foreclosures continued through 1984 and 1985. More auctions every month, more families displaced, more farms sold for a fraction of what they'd cost. The county that had been vibrant and growing just 5 years earlier was now bleeding out, dying slowly. Silas started getting calls from neighbors, not asking for money, most of them were too proud for that, but asking for help. How do you rebuild a carburetor when you can't afford to buy a new one? How do you fix a hydraulic leak? How do you keep a 30-year-old tractor running when the dealer wants $3,000 to repair it, and you don't have $3,000? Silas helped anyone who asked. No questions, no judgment. He opened his shop to farmers who needed to fix their equipment but couldn't afford the dealer's rates, showed them how to do the work themselves, gave them tools to borrow, sold them parts at sometimes gave them parts for nothing if he had extras lying around, asked for nothing in return. "Why are you doing this?" Maggie asked one evening after 3 different farmers had been in the shop that day, taking up most of Silas's time. "Because I can," Silas said, cleaning grease off his hands with the rag. "And because it could have been me. If the market had gone the other way, if prices had stayed high, if land values had kept climbing, Victor would be wealthy and I'd be the fool. I'd be the one losing everything. And I'd hope someone would help me." He hung up the rag. "I'm not trying to profit from the crisis. I'm just trying to help people survive it. That's all any of us can do." But Victor Brennan wouldn't survive. Not as a farmer. November 1985, late at night. Victor stood in his barn with a rope in his hands. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes, looking at the beam overhead, thinking about his father. His father who'd lost everything in 1953. His father who'd been found in this same barn 32 years ago. His father whose death had been officially called a heart attack, but wasn't. Victor knew the truth now. Had finally asked his mother a year ago when things got really bad when he needed to know. She'd cried and told him everything. Told him what she'd never told anyone else. What she'd kept secret for 32 years. His father had hanged himself in this barn. The debt, the failure, the shame, the humiliation of losing everything in front of the whole community, it had been too much. He'd left a wife and 3 children with nothing. Victor had been 9 years old. Now Victor stood with the same rope, the same beam, the same despair washing over him in waves. He'd already tied the noose, already measured the drop, already written the note sitting on the workbench explaining to Claudette and the kids why he couldn't do this anymore, why he couldn't face another day of failure. He heard the barn door open, footsteps on the concrete floor. Victor, Claudette's voice. He froze. She shouldn't be here. It was past midnight. She should be asleep. She came around the tractor, saw him standing there with the rope, and screamed. Ran to him, wrestled the rope out of his hands. Both of them on the ground now. The rope between them, Claudette crying and shouting and holding him and, "No, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to leave me. You don't get to quit." Victor was crying too now. 32 years of pain and fear and trying to prove he was better than his father, it all coming out at once. "I can't do this anymore," he sobbed. "I can't face them. Can't face the bank. Can't face the neighbors. Can't face myself because I tried so hard to be different, to be better than him, but I'm just like him. Exact same. Just took longer to fail." Claudette held him rocking back and forth. "Your father didn't just have a heart attack, did he?" she said quietly. Victor shook his head, unable to speak. "He did this, in this barn." "Yes." "When you were 9." "Yes." Claudette was quiet for a long moment, still holding him. "Then you're not like him," she said finally, her voice fierce. "Because he gave up. He quit. He left his family to deal with everything alone. And you're still here. You're still fighting. You're still trying." She pulled back, looked him in the face. "We're going to lose the farm. We both know it. We're going to lose everything. But we haven't lost each other. And we haven't lost our kids. And as long as we have that, we have something. We have more than your father had. We have each other." They sat there in the barn holding each other, crying together until the sun came up. Sunday, 2 days later, First Baptist Church. The congregation was settling in for the 11 o'clock service. People taking their seats, greeting neighbors, opening hymnals. The organ playing softly. Everything normal. Then Claudette Brennan walked in. She looked different, very different. Her hair wasn't styled, no makeup. She wore a simple dress, nothing fancy, nothing expensive, nothing like the designer clothes she'd worn for years. She walked slowly down the center aisle, everyone watching her, the organ still playing. She walked all the way to the front, turned to face the congregation. "I need to say something," she said, her voice not loud but carrying in the silence. Pastor Patterson, about to start the service, stopped. The organist's hands froze on the keys. The church went completely, absolutely silent. "My husband and I are losing everything," Claudette said. "The farm, the equipment, the house, everything we built, everything we thought we had, it's all going away." Her voice broke, but she kept going. "And it's my fault as much as his, maybe more. I pushed him. I wanted the new things, the nice clothes, the trips to Florida, the remodeled kitchen. I wanted people to look at us and see success, to see that we were doing better than everyone else. I wanted to feel important, special." Tears were running down her face now, but she didn't wipe them away. "And I was cruel to people who didn't have what we had. Cruel to people who were smarter than us, who made better choices." She looked directly at Maggie Warren sitting in the third row with Silas and Malcolm. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for how I treated you, for the things I said, for the way I made you feel. You and Silas were right all along. You were wishaway and we were fools. You were careful and we were reckless. And I'm sorry." The tears were coming faster now, her voice breaking. "We're losing everything, but I realized something. We haven't lost each other. Victor and I, we still have each other. We still have our kids. We still have our health and our faith in each other. And maybe that's all that really matters. Maybe that's what I should have been proud of all along, instead of things that didn't matter." She walked back to her seat. The church was completely silent, except for the sound of her footsteps and her quiet crying. Pastor Patterson, visibly moved, took a moment to compose himself before beginning the service. After church in the parking lot, Maggie walked over to where Claudette stood by her car. An older car now, not the new Cadillac they'd had. That had been sold months ago to make a payment. Thank you for saying that, Maggie said quietly. That took a lot of courage. Claudette looked at her with red, swollen eyes. I don't deserve your kindness. Not after how I treated you. Yes, you do, Maggie said. We all make mistakes. We all want things we shouldn't want. We all get lost sometimes. She paused. If you need anything, help with anything, you call me. Okay, day or night, you call. Claudette nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Then she reached out and hugged Maggie, both women crying now, years of tension and judgment and pain flowing out. Other women from the church came over, slowly at first, then more, offering help, offering friendship, offering forgiveness. The crisis had broken something in the community, but it was also in a strange way healing something, bringing people back to what mattered. March 1986. The final notice appeared in the Warren County Record. All remaining assets of Victor Brennan to be sold at public auction. 1,200 acres of land, all remaining equipment, household items, everything. The auction was Saturday at the county fairgrounds, the same place where they'd sold the first 600 acres 3 years earlier, coming full circle. Silas drove there with Maggie. They didn't talk much on the way. What was there to say? The fairgrounds was crowded, maybe 150 people. News crews from Galesburg and Peoria. Foreclosure auctions had become newsworthy. The farm crisis was the story of the decade. The land was divided into 3 parcels, 600 acres, 400 acres, 200 acres. Easier to sell in smaller chunks. Might get more money that way. Silas wasn't interested in all of it. The 600 was too much. The 200 was too small. But the 400 acres bordered his farm on 2 sides. He could work it easily with his current equipment. When the bidding started on the 400 acres, Silas sat quietly. The auctioneer opened at $1,000 an acre. A few hands went up. The price climbed slowly. 600, 650, 700. At 700 an acre, Silas raised his hand for the first time. I've got 700, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 750? The other bidder, a farmer from Galesburg. Silas didn't know, shook his head and sat down. Going once at 700 an acre, going twice. Sold to bidder number 47 for $700 an acre. 700 an acre. 400 acres, $280,000 total. Victor had paid $1,900 an acre for that ground in 1980. 6 years ago, now it was selling for $700, $1,200 an acre loss. On 400 acres, that was $480,000 just gone, vanished like it had never existed. Silas walked to the settlement table where Patricia sat with paperwork, the same woman who'd handled the foreclosures for years now. She looked tired, worn down by processing the destruction of so many families. Silas pulled out his checkbook, the same worn checkbook he'd had for 15 years, wrote out the amount in his careful handwriting, $280,000. Patricia looked at the check, looked at Silas, looked back at the check with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been respect, or might have been both. Mr. Warren, this is for the full amount. Yes, ma'am. You're not financing any of it. No, ma'am, cash. She excused herself to verify the check, make sure it was good, make sure the money was there. While she was gone, Silas stood with his hands in his pockets, not looking around, not making eye contact with anyone. He didn't want to seem triumphant, didn't want anyone to think he was taking pleasure in this. Victor was still there, standing at the back of the building with a Claudette, watching everything, watching his life being sold off piece by piece. Patricia came back 5 minutes later. The check clears, she said, sounding slightly surprised. We'll have the title transferred to you by the end of next week. Silas nodded, collected his paperwork. The deed, the receipt, proof of purchase, 400 acres of Warren County, Illinois, now his. He turned to leave and found himself face to face with Victor. They looked at each other for a long moment. Take care of that ground, Victor said, finally, his voice rough with emotion. It's good land, better than the farmer. You weren't a bad farmer, Silas said. Just bad timing. Bad judgment, Victor corrected like he'd done before. You tried to tell me. Hell, your whole life tried to tell me. But I didn't want to listen. He looked at the paperwork in Silas's hand. I start at Caterpillar on Monday. Night shift. $14 an hour. Making tractor parts instead of using them. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. History repeating. Victor's father had worked at Caterpillar after losing his farm. Now Victor would do the same. I'm sorry, Silas said, and he meant it. He took no pleasure in this moment. Victor nodded, extended his hand, They shook. Claudette touched Victor's arm gently. We should go. They walked out of the fairgrounds, out of farming, out of the life they'd built and lost, walked toward a future of factory work and rental houses and memories of what might have been. Silas watched them go. Then he folded the deed into his jacket pocket and walked to his truck. Maggie was waiting. How do you feel? She asked as he climbed behind the wheel. Silas started the engine, sat there for a moment thinking about the question. Sad, he said finally. Victor was a good man, a hard worker. He just made the wrong bet at the wrong time. And in farming, the market doesn't give you a second chance. But we made the right bet. We made the scared bet, Silas corrected. Whether it was right or wrong, we'll never know. We just know it worked out, this time. They drove home through the March cold, past farms still standing and farms that had been foreclosed, past fields that would soon be planted, past a world that had changed completely in the 6 years since that confrontation at the bank. Silas Warren now owned 880 acres in Warren County, Illinois. All of it paid for, all of it free and clear, no mortgage, no debt, no bank holding any claim on any of it, just land and the freedom that came with owning it outright. The years that followed proved the pattern would repeat. It always does. In 993, another adjacent farm came up for sale. 320 acres. The farmer had died. His children wanted nothing to do with farming, and the land went on the market for $600 an acre. Cheap even by post-crisis standards. Silas bought it. Cash. $190,000. Now he owned 1,200 acres. All of it free and clear. But it was what happened in 98 that tested everything. Malcolm had come home from the University of Illinois in 1995 with a degree in agricultural economics. 20 years old, full of ideas about modern farming, GPS technology, precision, agriculture, data-driven decision-making. He looked at his father's operation, still farming with tractors from the 60s and 70s, still maintaining the super him now 41 years old, still doing things the way they'd been done for decades, and he saw a museum, an anachronism, something that belonged in the past. For 3 years, he worked alongside his father, learning the practical side of farming, getting his hands dirty, understanding what it took to make a living from the land. But in the summer of 1998, everything came to a head. Malcolm was 23 now, had been farming full-time for 3 years, and he'd gotten a job offer. One evening at dinner, he made his announcement. I got a job offer, he said, setting down his fork. Commodity trading firm in Chicago, Merrill Lynch, trading agricultural futures, $85,000 a year to start plus bonuses, full benefits, retirement plan, stock options. Silas set down his own fork slowly. What? It's a good opportunity, Dad. Real money, a career with room to grow. I could make 6 figures within a few years. What about the farm? What about it? Malcolm's voice had an edge to it, defensive. You can keep farming or rent the ground to someone else or hire help, but I can't keep doing this. Maggie was silent, watching her husband and son, feeling the tension building. Can't do what? Silas asked carefully. This. Malcolm gestured around the simple kitchen out the window at the farmyard with its old equipment. Living like we're still in the Depression, driving trucks older than I am, working on tractors that belong in museums. All my friends from college have normal jobs. They live in cities. They have nice apartments, new cars. They go out to restaurants and bars, and they have lives. And I'm here covered in grease every day, making a fraction of what they make, living like it's 1950. We own 1,200 acres free and clear, Silas said, his voice still calm but with steel underneath. Do you know what that's worth? I know what it's worth on paper, Dad. $1.8 million give or take. But we can't spend equity. We live like we're poor when we're actually wealthy on paper. What's the point of having all this if we never enjoy it, if we never do anything, or go anywhere, or have anything nice? The argument escalated, voices raised. Silas and Malcolm shouting at each other for the first time in Malcolm's life. Malcolm accusing his father of being stuck in the past, of being too afraid to live, of wasting his life being careful when he should be living. Silas accusing Malcolm of not understanding what they'd built, what they'd preserved, what it meant to be free of debt. You want to know what I understand, Malcolm said, his face red. I understand that Grandpa died at 58 in a field, heart attack, worked himself to death, and for what I understand that you've worked your whole life and have nothing to show for it but old equipment in an old truck in an old house that hasn't been updated since Grandma died. I understand that I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to work myself to death for nothing. It's not nothing, Silas said, his voice shaking. It's freedom. It's security. It's it's fear, Malcolm interrupted. It's being so scared of losing something that you never really have anything. It's existing instead of living. That word, existing, the same word Claudette Brennan had used 20 years earlier. Malcolm went upstairs, came down an hour later with 2 suitcases packed. I'm taking the job, he said. I start in 2 weeks. I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't do this anymore. He walked out, got in his car, a 1995 Honda Civic he'd bought used with money from farming, and drove away. Silas sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, feeling like he'd failed. Failed as a father, failed as a teacher, failed to pass on the lessons that had kept the family farming for over 100 years. Maggie sat next to him, took his hand. Maybe we did this wrong, Silas said quietly. Maybe we were too careful, too focused on not losing that we forgot how to live. Or maybe he needs to learn for himself, Maggie said. Like you had to learn, like I had to learn. You can tell someone what's true, but they have to discover it for themselves. And if he doesn't, if he stays in Chicago and never comes back, then that's his choice, and we have to respect it. He's not a child anymore. For 3 months, Silas barely spoke. He farmed the land alone, worked in the shop alone, ate dinner in near silence. Malcolm called once a week, brief conversations that were awkward and painful. Then came September 1998. The Asian financial crisis spread. Russian debt default. Long-term capital management collapse, nearly taking the financial system with it. Stock market convulsing. The news full of economic catastrophe. Malcolm called on a Tuesday evening, his voice shaking. Dad, can I come home this weekend? I need to talk to you. Of course. Saturday afternoon, Malcolm's car pulled into the farmyard. The Honda Civic, 2 years old now, financed at 8.9% for 5 years because he hadn't had enough saved for cash. He looked different, thinner, paler, like he hadn't been sleeping or eating right. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where every important conversation in this family happened. The firm is laying people off, Malcolm said without preamble. Market's in chaos, huge losses. They're cutting 40% of staff. Last hired, first fired. I've been there 8 months. I'm gone. 2 weeks severance and that's it. Silas waited. Let Malcolm talk. But that's not even the worst part. Living in Chicago, Dad, my rent is $1,800 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that's not even that nice. I'm paying $400 on the car, $200 for student loans, another $100 for car insurance, $50 for parking because there is no street parking. By the time I pay for food and utilities and subway passes and everything else, I'm broke. I'm making $85,000 a year and I'm broke. He looked at his father with tears in his eyes. And I realized something. I'm not free. I thought I was. I thought having a salary and a career and living in a city made me free. But I'm not. I have a nice apartment I'm never in because I work 80 hours a week. I have a nice car I can't afford to pay off. I have a salary that looks good on paper but disappears every month into rent and payments and bills. And I'm terrified all the time. Terrified of losing the job. Terrified of missing a payment. Terrified of ending up on the street. I haven't slept a full night in months. The tears spilled over. You were right, Dad, about all of it. About debt, about freedom, about what matters. I just couldn't see it until I didn't have it anymore. Until I was the one lying awake at 3 in the morning worrying about money. Silas reached across the table, put his hand on his son's. Come home, he said simply. Come back to the farm. You still want me after what I said, after I left? Of course I want you. You're my son. This is your home. It was always your home. It will always be your home. Come back. Malcolm came home 2 weeks later, sold the Honda at a loss, paid off what he owed on it, quit the apartment, lost his security deposit, didn't care, started farming alongside his father again. It took him 6 months to decompress, to stop waking up at 3 in the morning in a panic, to remember how to sleep without fear, to rediscover what it felt like to own your time instead of selling it. But he learned, slowly, carefully, learned that freedom matters more than money, that owning matters more than having, that peace matters more than profit. And he never left again. 2008 brought another financial crisis, housing market collapse, banks failing, the economy in freefall, but grain prices went up. Ethanol mandates kept demand high. Corn hit $7 a bushel by 2012, the highest it had been in history, and farmers started borrowing again. Same pattern, same optimism, same belief that this time was different. New combines at $450,000, tractors at $350,000. Some operations taking on 2, 3, even 4 million in debt to expand. Silas, now 72 years old and watching from semi-retirement, while Malcolm ran the day-to-day operations, saw it all happening again. They never learn, he told Maggie one evening. Some do, she said. Malcolm learned. That was true. Malcolm, now 37, farmed the 1,200 acres debt-free. He'd bought some newer equipment, but always used, always cash, always maintaining the philosophy his father had taught him. In 2015, the pattern repeated. Grain prices fell from $7 to $4, soybeans from 16 to 9. The farmers who'd borrowed at the peak suddenly couldn't make payments. And in 2016, the foreclosures started again. One of them was Frank Peterson. Different Peterson, no relation to any of the others, but the same story playing out again. Bought 800 acres in 2011 at $8,500 an acre. All financed. Couldn't make the payments when prices fell. Malcolm went to the auction. Silas, too old now, stayed home. But Malcolm represented the family. When 480 acres of Peterson's land came up for bid, Malcolm raised his hand. Won at $4,200 an acre, $2,016,000. Cash. Frank Peterson approached Malcolm afterward, looking like he'd aged 20 years and 5. Tell your dad he was right, Frank said. Tell him I should have listened to the old-timers, should have been more scared. My dad says he wasn't right, Malcolm told him. Just scared, says there's a difference. Is there, though? Frank asked. Seems like being scared is the same as being smart in farming. But there was one more moment that day. One more piece of the pattern completing itself. The remaining 320 acres of Peterson's farm came up for bid. Malcolm was about to bid when he heard another voice. 2,000. Malcolm turned. A man in his 40s stood in the back of the crowd. Something familiar about him. The build, the eyes, the bidding continued. Up to 5,000 an acre. Malcolm dropped out. Too expensive, not worth it. Sold to bidder 73 for 5,000 an acre. After the auction, the man approached Malcolm. Malcolm Warren. Yes, I'm Sam Brennan. Victor Brennan was my father. Malcolm's eyes widened in recognition. He'd heard the stories all his life. His father's confrontation with Victor in the bank, the foreclosures, everything that had happened. He died last year, Sam continued. Worked at Caterpillar for 29 years. Never farmed again after he lost everything. But before he died in the hospital, he told me everything. About your grandfather. About the 1980s crisis. About his mistakes. About your family's wisdom. He looked at the paperwork in his hand. The deed to 320 acres he'd just bought. He made me promise something. Said don't ever borrow money to buy land. Save cash. Wait for the crashes. They always come. Buy when everyone else is panicking. Farm what you own, not what the bank owns. So I worked for 15 years. Lived in a small apartment. Drove old cars. Saved every penny. Got to 1.6 million in cash. Then I waited. Sam extended his hand. Tell your grandfather his example didn't just save your family. It saved mine too. My father's story taught me what not to do. Your grandfather's story taught me what to do. Between them, I learned the lesson. Malcolm shook his hand, too moved to speak. 2 families, 2 different paths, both learning from the same crisis, one through failure, one through success. But both learning, present day, 2020. Silas Warren is 84 years old, still lives in the farmhouse where he grew up, where his father grew up, where his grandfather built the original structure in 1895. Still walks out to the shop most days, though his hands shake now, and he moves slowly, carefully, like someone walking on ice. The farm is run by Malcolm, 45 years old now, strong and confident, carrying on the tradition. And helping Malcolm is Silas Warren II, 19 years old, great-grandson, 4th generation, another link in the chain. On a hot July afternoon with the corn waist high and the beans flowering, Silas is teaching his great-grandson how to rebuild the Super M's carburetor. The tractor is 66 years old now, older than most of the farmers in Warren County, older than anyone still farming in the area. But it still runs, still works, still represents everything the Warren family believes. The carburetor is disassembled on a clean tarp on the shop floor, each part laid out in order, each piece waiting to be cleaned, inspected, and reinstalled. Grandpa Young Silas says, holding a tiny brass jet up to the light, "Why do we still use this tractor? I mean, it's cool and everything, like a piece of history. But we have way newer stuff. We've got that 2015 case that's basically a computer on wheels. Why keep this old thing running?" Silas looks at his great-grandson, sees his own face 70 years younger, sees the same curiosity, The same questions every generation asks. Why do things the old way when there's a new way? Come here, Silas says. He leads the boy to the big window on the east side of the shop, the window that looks out over the farm. From here you can see fields stretching to the horizon, 1,680 acres of corn and soybeans. You can see the machine shed where they keep the working equipment. You can see the grain bins where they store the harvest. You can see the farmhouse where 4 generations of Warrens have lived. You see that land? Silas asks. Yeah, all 1680. You know how much debt we have on it? None, the boy says. He's heard this before, heard it many times, but he doesn't mind hearing it again. That's right, none, zero, not a penny owed to any bank, any creditor, any lender. It's all ours. And you know why? The boy shrugs, waiting for his great-grandfather to tell him. Because your great-great-grandfather Elias taught your great-grandfather Theodore to be scared of debt. And Theodore taught Meathfim, and I taught your grandfather Malcolm, and now I'm teaching you. He turns back to the Super M, its engine exposed, its parts spread across the floor. This tractor is a reminder, Silas says. Every time I work on it, every time I use it, every time I see it sitting there, I remember that the best equipment is the equipment that's paid for. The best farm is the farm you own. And the best sleep you'll ever get is when you don't owe anybody a dime. He puts his hand on his great-grandson's shoulder. His hand is old now, liver-spotted, shaking slightly. But it's the hand that's farmed this land for 66 years. The hand that rebuilt this tractor's engine 3 times. The hand that signed the check for $280,000 cash in 1986. The world's going to try to sell you on debt, Silas continues. Banks will tell you it's smart to leverage. Dealers will tell you you need the newest equipment. Other farmers will make you feel like you're falling behind if you're not constantly expanding, constantly upgrading. But you remember this. He pauses to make sure the boy's listening. Most banks will foreclose on you if you miss 2 payments. Most dealers don't care if you can actually afford what they're selling. They just care about making the sale. And most other farmers are 1 bad year away from losing everything they've worked for their whole lives. Another pause. This land will be here long after all of us are gone, Silas says, looking back out the window. It was here before Elias. It'll be here after you're gone. The question isn't whether the land will survive. The question is whether our family will still own it, whether we'll still be farming it, whether we'll still be free. He turns back to face his great-grandson. The only way to make sure that happens is to never, ever let the bank own it. The minute you take debt on land, it's not yours anymore. It's theirs. And they will take it from you the first chance they get. The first time you can't pay. The first time the market turns against you. They won't care about your family or your history or your hard work. They'll just take it. Young Silas is quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he says, I get it, Grandpa. I really do. Good, Silas says. Now let's get this carburetor back together before dinner. They return to work, grandfather and great-grandson, 84 and 19, working on a tractor that's older than both of them combined, a tractor that represents everything this family has learned over 4 generations. Every mistake avoided, every temptation resisted, every hard choice that led to survival. Outside, the wind blows across 1,680 acres of paid-for ground. The same wind that blew when Elias Warren first broke the prairie in 1889. The same wind that blew when Theodore farmed it through the Depression. The same wind that blew when Silas farmed it through the 1980s crisis. The same wind that will blow long after all of them are gone. The land doesn't care about debt or interest rates or farm policy or market crashes or human ambition. It just is. Patient, eternal, waiting. It was here before humans, and it will be here after humans. It doesn't judge. It doesn't choose sides. It just exists. But the Warrens are still farming it, still teaching their children to be scared of debt, still keeping that old Super M running as a reminder of what matters. In the shop, Silas tightens the last bolt on the carburetor. His hands are old and scarred, and they shake, but they still remember the work, still know every thread, every torque spec, every trick his father taught him 70 years ago. The Super M starts on the first try. The engine catches, settles into that familiar rhythm, that sound Silas has heard his entire life, the sound of paid-for equipment, the sound of freedom, the sound of survival. Young Silas grins. It sounds good. It always does, Silas says. When you take care of things, they take care of you. He shuts the engine down. The shop falls quiet again. On the hood of the tractor, painted there in neat letters when Silas restored it in 2018, are words that tell the whole story. Paid for in 1954, still working in 2020. And below that, in smaller letters, debt kills, patience wins. Silas Warren walks back to the farmhouse as the sun sets over Warren County. 84 years old. Farmer, father, grandfather, great-grandfather. The man who survived by being too scared to take risks. The man who won by refusing to play the game everyone else was playing. On the porch, Maggie is sitting in her chair. 81 years old now. Still keeping the books, still managing the household, still the quiet strength behind everything they built. He sits next to her, takes her hand. Malcolm did good today, Maggie says. He did. Bought that Peterson ground at a good price, $4,200 an acre. It'll produce well for us. And young Silas is learning. He understands, really understands, the way Malcolm didn't until he learned the hard way. They sit in comfortable silence watching the sun set over land that's been in their family for 131 years. The land is still there, the Warren family is still farming it. The 1954 Farmall Super M is still running, and the lessons learned through 4 generations of joy and pain, success and failure, fear and wisdom are being passed on to a 5th generation. Proof that sometimes being called a fool is the smartest thing that can happen to you. Proof that debt kills and patience wins. Proof that the old ways, the scared ways, the careful ways, the paid-for ways are the only ways that last.